me, it was the self-sacrifice that really drew me to Carmel, and love. It's not kind of suffering for the sake of suffering.
They lived in silence, hidden behind stone walls, women bound by faith, by prayer, by vows that no war should touch.
But it can be like that. It's for love, because we love Jesus.
But one night the storm came. Iron gates shattered, candles died, and vows were broken by force. What began as a conquest turned into something darker, an unholy desecration of the sacred. Yet beneath the ashes of history lies a truth long buried, one that still trembles with horror and defiance. This is the untold story of what the Ottomans did to the Christian nuns. The day the cloister fell. The assault began in the hour before dawn, a time once reserved for prayer and silence. The first sign of danger came as heavy rhythmic blows echoed through the compound, hammering against the main gate. The thick wooden beams, built for seclusion and safety, began to crack under the relentless force. From within, the steady chanting of morning prayers faltered, then died away, replaced by shouts of male voices.
"It will come after you next. Don't let it have you. You know what you must do." I can't.
And the harsh scrape of boots across the stone courtyard. Life inside the convent had always followed a strict and sacred order. The days revolved around prayer, devotion, and quiet labor. Some sisters tended the vegetable gardens that sustained the community. Others spent long hours in the copying rooms, carefully reproducing holy texts by hand. The infirmary, humble but vital, welcomed the sick and the poor from nearby villages. High walls enclosed all of this, a physical and spiritual barrier meant to guard a life devoted to contemplation. That fragile sense of safety vanished in moments. Armed figures poured into the chapel, their features thrown into sharp relief by the flickering lamplight. The first blows fell not on people but on symbols. Head coverings were ripped away, stripping the women of the visible signs of their vows. Then came the desecration of the sacred space itself. Precious metal vessels were snatched up, while knives and blades pried gemstones and gilding from icons and altars, leaving gouged wood and torn canvases behind. The elderly woman who led the community tried to stand her ground, stepping between the intruders and her sisters. She was shoved aside with brutal force, collapsing to the floor. Nearby, a younger novice froze, too terrified to move or speak. There was no real struggle, only fear, confusion, and helpless surrender. The women were dragged out by their arms and garments, herded through the shattered gate, and forced into a larger group of displaced captives waiting under guard. Behind them, the convent stood hollow and desecrated, its silence now that of ruin rather than reverence. When the last of them disappeared into the departing column, the question lingered over the empty compound. Was this a singular act of violence, or merely a recent occurrence of a much older pattern of conquest and sacrilege? They were not the first. The walls that had protected the city for a millennium failed at dawn on the 29th of May, 1453. The once impregnable Theodosian walls, long regarded as unbreakable, were finally breached by cannon fire and scaling ladders in the final hours of the siege. When the Ottoman troops poured through the shattered defenses, ordinary citizens fled toward the basilicas and monasteries in desperate search of safety. Many crowded into the great church of Hagia Sophia, while others sought shelter in smaller sanctuaries scattered across the city. Inside these sacred spaces, nuns and other religious women prayed among relics that had endured for centuries, including those once kept in the now-ruined Church of the Holy Apostles. That church had been a center of monastic devotion, a home to revered relics and prayerful communities. But as the walls fell, the illusion of safety within holy enclosures collapsed. Those who believed themselves protected by faith found themselves utterly exposed. The streets that once echoed with hymns now rang with the crash of gates, the clash of soldiers, and the cries of the terrified. In the hours that followed, the city became a landscape of slaughter, seizure, and flight. The fall marked not only a military defeat, but the violent end of centuries of Christian dominance, a moment that reverberated far beyond the city's boundaries. As the conquerors advanced, churches were stripped and looted. The wounded could not flee. The old and infirm were abandoned or slain. Monastic communities that had lived in contemplation were engulfed in chaos and destruction. Historian Michael Kritovoulos wrote that young and chaste women of noble birth were torn from their chambers and carried off without mercy or honor. In the aftermath, neither noble lineage nor religious devotion offered protection. Women who had taken vows or lived in seclusion shared the same fate as others. Their faith, their sanctity, their station, all were rendered meaningless by conquest. Contemporary accounts tell of captives taken wholesale from churches and monasteries, paraded through the streets and sold in public markets. Dukas recorded how noble families watched helplessly as their wives and daughters were dragged away, while their homes were emptied of sacred vessels and treasures. In these markets of despair, clerics and nuns once devoted to silence and prayer were treated as spoils of war. Their vows held no weight. Only their youth, position, and vulnerability mattered. The harsh laws of conquest prevailed: enslavement, forced conversion, and submission to the victor. The fall of the city was not merely a military triumph, but a spiritual and cultural conquest. The plundering of relics, the desecration of churches, and their conversion into mosques served as deliberate symbols of victory. Holy treasures were trampled and scattered, their sacred worth reduced to mere coin. Through such acts, the Ottoman Empire transformed conquest into empire building. Its message of dominance carried through generations. The memory of 1453 endured, invoked whenever Christian communities under its rule dared to resist. And yet, when the same cries rose again in 1915, why did the great powers of Europe and America, aware of this long-established pattern, stand by and watch in silence? The unstoppable. One of the key witnesses to the unfolding horror in the Ottoman Empire was Henry Morgenthau Sr., the United States ambassador in Constantinople from 1913 to 1916. By mid-July of 1915, he had concluded that what was happening to the Armenian population was nothing less than a campaign of race extermination. In his telegram to Washington on July 16, he described the deportation of and excesses against peaceful Armenians. In his later memoirs, Morgenthau reflected that the whole history of the human race contains no such horrible episode as this. He recalled women and children arriving at his embassy in tears, recounting forced marches, starvation, and deaths along the roads. These first-hand accounts offered irrefutable diplomatic evidence that the United States was aware of mass atrocities. Morgenthau observed that when Turkish officials issued orders for deportation, they were effectively signing a death warrant for an entire people, and they did so openly, without pretense. His reports made clear that extermination was not incidental but deliberate. Beyond Morgenthau's testimony, numerous other sources confirmed the scale of the atrocities. German missionaries operating throughout Anatolia gathered eyewitness accounts describing forced marches, internment camps, and the looting of Christian villages. German officers attached to Ottoman units sent back reports that mirrored these findings. Journalists for Western newspapers, too, published front-page stories detailing deportations and massacres, while missionary diaries and consular cables filled archives with consistent records of violence. The German ambassador in Constantinople, Hans von Wangenheim, was fully aware of what was happening. Archival records show that he reported to Berlin, but pursued only policies aimed at preserving the Ottoman alliance. No public protests or official action were taken on behalf of the Armenians. Across Europe and America, the information was available, the testimonies were credible, and the knowledge was widespread. Yet, despite this clear awareness, no nation acted decisively. Germany, bound by wartime alliance, placed military strategy above morality. Historical documents reveal its position plainly. The priority was to keep Turkey loyal to the Central Powers, regardless of how many Armenians perished. The Allied powers, preoccupied with their own battles, focused on the trenches, the blockades, and the defense of the empire. The United States, while receiving Morgenthau's reports, insisted that the atrocities were an internal matter of the Ottoman Empire and refused to intervene militarily. Realpolitik prevailed, and national interests outweighed humanitarian duty. At the time, there existed no international mechanism capable of enforcing moral responsibility or punishing such crimes. In this void of accountability, the Ottoman leadership acted with impunity. Alliance politics, wartime distraction, and legal paralysis combined to create the perfect silence in which extermination could proceed unchecked. The question then turns inward. What legal and social system within the Ottoman Empire had for so long conditioned its Muslim population to see their Christian neighbors not as fellow citizens, but as permissible targets? A system designed for oppression. The Ottoman Empire inherited from earlier Islamic governance a legal framework known as the dhimmi system, the protection contract that defined relations between Muslims and non-Muslims. Its origins lay in the Pact of Umar, a 7th-century agreement attributed to Caliph Umar ibn al-Khattab and preserved in Islamic legal writings. The pact granted Jews and Christians the right to practice their religion in exchange for loyalty to Muslim rulers and payment of the jizya, a poll tax on adult non-Muslim males. In theory, this tax compensated for exemption from military service and guaranteed state protection. In practice, however, its collection carried a ritual of submission. Ottoman fiscal manuals describe how taxpayers were required to appear before a Muslim officer, present their payment, and sometimes bow or strike their chest in acknowledgement of subordination. Within Ottoman law, non-Muslims were classified as dhimmis, protected persons. Yet that protection rested entirely on the ruler's will. Historians such as Benjamin Braud and Bernard Lewis note that while the dhimma system offered limited tolerance by medieval standards, it also institutionalized legal inequality and social exclusion. These inequalities were clearly expressed through daily restrictions. Ottoman kanun names and provincial law codes reaffirmed limits drawn from classical Islamic jurisprudence. Churches and synagogues could not be built without state permission, and repairs to old ones required the Sultan's explicit approval. Non-Muslims were forbidden to proselytize among Muslims or to bear arms. Distinctive dress codes were sometimes imposed. Under Sultan Murad III in the late 16th century, Christian men were ordered to wear blue turbans and Jews yellow ones. Legal hierarchy extended into the courts, where the testimony of a Christian or Jew could not be accepted against a Muslim in a Sharia tribunal, restricting access to justice and reinforcing subordination. Even when these laws were inconsistently enforced, they remained powerful tools of coercion. During periods of unrest or economic strain, they could be revived to justify punishment or exclusion. The system taught that coexistence was conditional and that protection could be withdrawn at any moment, by decree, by mob, or by war. Beneath the appearance of imperial tolerance lay a constant imbalance that shaped how minorities were viewed. Generations of Muslims grew up within a structure that portrayed Christians and Jews as tolerated but inferior communities, surviving only under the Sultan's mercy. When nationalist and sectarian tensions rose in the 19th and early 20th centuries, this ingrained perception made it easier for propaganda and local authorities to brand Christian minorities as disloyal or expendable. During the Tanzimat reforms, the empire formally abolished the jizya and declared legal equality for all citizens. Yet implementation faltered, and resentment deepened on both sides. By 1915, decades of unequal treatment, intermittent reforms, and recurring pogroms had created a volatile atmosphere. The old belief that dhimmis lived only by conditional protection meant that when wartime fear took hold, revoking that protection seemed both lawful and inevitable. But the reach of this system went far beyond taxes and clothing. It extended into the private sphere, shaping how the state sought to dismantle the foundations of Christian family life itself, ensuring control not only over faith but over identity and survival. The unraveling of an empire. The 19th century did not simply weaken the Ottoman Empire. It transformed its entire relationship with its Christian subjects. turning centuries of managed inequality into an existential threat. For generations, imperial order had rested on the millet system, which divided society along religious lines and granted non-Muslims a protected but subordinate status as dhimmis. This structure was vertical and unquestioned. The Sultan stood at the top, and beneath him, each religious community owed loyalty and obedience to his rule. That balance began to fracture with the rise of the European nation-state. Enlightenment ideals of sovereignty and self-determination undermined the legitimacy of rule by divine right. The Greek War of Independence in the 1820s proved decisive. It showed that a Christian people could break free from Ottoman control and win European support. The success of Greece emboldened others. Serbs, Bulgarians, and other Balkan Christians began to imagine their own national liberation. At the same time, the empire endured military defeats, financial collapse, and territorial loss, earning it the label, the sick man of Europe. Among the ruling Muslim elite, this decline was increasingly interpreted not as mere misfortune, but as the result of Christian betrayal and foreign manipulation. When reformers introduced the Tanzimat measures between 1839 and 1876, aimed at equality before the law, they provoked backlash rather than reconciliation. To many Muslims, granting equal status to Christians appeared not as justice, but as humiliation imposed by Western powers. Out of that resentment grew a deep sense of paranoia. Christian minorities, especially the Armenians, who lacked a nearby Christian state to defend them, came to be seen as a hidden threat, an internal enemy within a disintegrating empire. That latent hostility erupted into open violence under Sultan Abdul Hamid II. Once celebrated as the Millet-i-Sadiqa, or loyal millet, the Armenians began to demand reforms promised under international treaties after the Congress of Berlin. Abdul Hamid, distrustful of Europe and reliant on his authority as caliph, branded these petitions as a prelude to rebellion. He deliberately inflamed religious zeal and economic envy to rally support. Between 1894 and 1896, waves of coordinated massacres swept through Armenian towns and villages. Local officials armed irregular forces and tribal auxiliaries, while regular troops stood aside or joined in. Reports from the time estimated between 100,000 and 300,000 dead. In Urfa, hundreds were burned alive inside cathedrals where they had sought refuge. These massacres revealed two critical truths. The Ottoman state could systematically target an ethnic population, and those responsible would face no punishment. The Hamidian massacres thus became a rehearsal for future atrocities, a demonstration of both capability and impunity. The brief optimism that followed the revolution of 1908, when the Committee of Union and Progress promised equality under a new constitution, quickly dissolved. In April 1909, the Adana Vilayet descended into chaos. Local tensions exploded into a month of organized pogroms, where mobs, joined by elements of the army and gendarmerie, looted, burned, and killed with near-total freedom. Estimates place the death toll between 20 and 30,000 Armenians. The Adana massacre showed that anti-Armenian violence was not confined to a single ruler. It was embedded within the machinery of the state and society itself. Political change, rather than dissolving prejudice, exposed how deeply it had taken root. The erosion of central authority and persistence of old enmities made renewed violence not less likely, but inevitable. From these crises emerged an ideological transformation that laid the foundation for later annihilation. The Young Turks, after seizing power, abandoned the inclusive rhetoric of Ottomanism and embraced a militant synthesis of Turkish nationalism and pan-Turkish thought. Under this new ideology, Armenians and Greeks were no longer tolerated inferiors. They were now portrayed as obstacles to a pure Turkish nation-state. Thus, religious hierarchy merged with modern racial nationalism. When the First World War broke out, it provided both the opportunity and the justification. The blueprint for ethnic cleansing was already in place, shaped by decades of reform, repression, and massacre. What followed was not a sudden descent into barbarity, but the final act in a long process of deliberate unmaking. Yet even before the Great War, the empire had already rehearsed the destruction of a people's most fundamental bonds, its families, its faith, and its future. Stealing the future. Among the institutions that defined Ottoman power, none struck deeper into the Christian soul of the empire than the devshirme, or child levy. Instituted in the late 14th century under Sultan Murad I, it represented the most systematic form of demographic control in early modern Europe. Every few years, Ottoman officials would arrive in the Christian villages of the Balkans and Anatolia, bearing imperial edicts that compelled local clergy and elders to assemble the boys of the parish. The Ottoman inspectors examined each child for physical strength, intelligence, and beauty. The last a grim reminder that these selections were as much about domination as about service. The chosen were taken from their families, marched hundreds of miles to the capital, forcibly converted to Islam, and forbidden to speak their mother tongues. Contemporary chronicles describe mothers clutching their sons' garments, begging the soldiers for mercy, while priests performed last-minute blessings as if for the dead. Once registered, the boys were divided. The most promising sent to the palace schools for administrative training. The rest dispatched to the Janissary barracks for military conditioning. By severing these children from their faith and family, the Ottomans built a loyal elite unbound by kinship or tribal ties. The Janissaries, the Sultan's standing army, were the most feared infantry of their age, and almost all were products of this levy. Others rose to become governors, viziers, or court officials, their Christian origins erased, but never forgotten by those left behind. In this way, the empire conquered with the sons of those it had conquered. Historians such as Halil İnalcık and Kemal Kafadar note that this system gave the Ottomans an unparalleled administrative flexibility. The most talented minds from Christian subjects were assimilated into the Muslim ruling class, creating a state that renewed itself through the very populations it subjugated. Yet the moral dimension was darker. This was not a tax of coin, but of blood, a policy that drained Christian communities of their youth and vitality. In villages from Albania to Armenia, the devshirme became a symbol of existential vulnerability, proof that the empire claimed not just the people's land and labor, but their lineage and faith itself. Families lived in perpetual dread of the recruiting caravans, often hiding their sons or disguising them as girls to escape selection. Folk songs from the Balkans and eastern Anatolia still preserve laments for the taken ones, comparing them to lambs led from the flock. The system fractured the very idea of continuity. A Christian child who became a Muslim soldier could never return home. If he did, he came as part of the force that ruled his own people. In this way, the devshirme waged not only a physical campaign, but a spiritual one, teaching subjugated Christians that resistance was futile, for their own blood might one day be turned against them. Even after the levy formally ended in the 17th century, its memory remained a generational wound that festered into the 20th century, when the Ottoman state once again targeted Christian people. But was the Ottoman campaign of annihilation focused solely on living bodies, or did it also seek to erase all physical traces of a Christian presence from the land? Erasing a people's memory. The eradication of a civilization does not end when its people are gone. It continues in the silence that follows, in the erasure of their temples, their schools, their graves. The Ottoman conquest of Constantinople in the year 1453 set the tone for centuries to come. When Sultan Mehmed II rode into the fallen city, he entered the Hagia Sophia and ordered its conversion into a mosque. The altar was torn down, the cross removed, and the mosaics of Christ and the Virgin Mary plastered over. What followed was not a momentary act of triumph, but the opening move of a deliberate cultural transformation. Thousands of churches and monasteries across Anatolia and the Balkans suffered the same fate. Some were converted to mosques, others left to decay, their stones scavenged for new imperial buildings. Byzantine basilicas became Ottoman prayer halls, their domes echoing with new calls to worship. Over time, the once dense network of Christian institutions was methodically thinned out, replaced by the architecture of the conqueror, and the Christian East was never the same again. Centuries later, the policy of cultural obliteration reached its apogee during the massacres and deportations of 1915. As Armenian and Greek communities were driven from their homes, the monuments of their faith were targeted with equal precision. The grand Armenian Cathedral of the Holy Trinity in Edirne was stripped of its treasures before being demolished. In the Caucasus, the Armenian quarter of Shushi, a vibrant center of learning and liturgy, was burned, its manuscripts and icons destroyed. In the ancient plains of Taron, the revered Sırp Karapet Monastery, founded before the coming of the Crusades, was looted and reduced to rubble by Ottoman troops. Reports from American consuls and German missionaries describe entire regions where Christian sites were systematically obliterated, cemeteries bulldozed, churches converted into stables or barracks, and inscriptions scraped from stone. The German archaeologist Armin Wegener wrote that it was as if a hand were reaching out to erase an entire people's footprint from the earth. This relentless campaign of destruction seems uniquely brutal in its scale and systematic nature. But was the Ottoman Empire an outlier? Or was it simply the most prolific practitioner of a darker, recurring theme in the history of Christian-Muslim conflict? A recurring nightmare. The Ottoman campaign against Christian civilization did not arise in a vacuum. Its foundations were laid centuries earlier, in the first great waves of Arab expansion during the 7th century. As Muslim armies swept through the Levant, Egypt, and North Africa, they encountered ancient Christian societies, Copts, Syriacs, Armenians, and Greeks, communities that had flourished since the dawn of the faith. These were not annihilated overnight. Instead, they were absorbed into a new system of subordination known as dhimma. Under it, Christians and Jews were permitted to live and worship, but only by accepting a permanent inferior status, payment of the jizya tax, prohibitions on new churches, and a public posture of submission before Islam. The arrangement was one of controlled coexistence, not equality. But coexistence was never guaranteed. At intervals, tolerance gave way to fury. In the 11th century, under the Fatimid Caliph al-Hakim bi-Amr Allah, a wave of destruction rolled through the Holy Land and Egypt. Churches were razed, monasteries burned, and Christians forced to flee. The most infamous act came in the year 1009, when al-Hakim ordered the demolition of the Church of the Holy Sepulchre in Jerusalem, the most sacred site in all of Christendom. Its walls were torn down stone by stone, its relics scattered, and its memory left as ash. For Christians across the world, it was a shock that reverberated for generations, a sign that the peace of the dhimmi was only as secure as the ruler's whim. Historians such as Bernard Lewis note that these spasms of persecution were not anomalies, but reminders of an underlying truth that coexistence under Islamic rule was conditional, and its boundaries could collapse without warning. By the time the Ottoman Empire reached its final century, this ancient system had evolved into something far more lethal. The Ottomans fused the legal mechanisms of dhimmitude with the instruments of modern governance. Bureaucracy replaced the sword, but the outcome was the same. In the 19th and early 20th centuries, as the empire's power waned, it sought unity through exclusion. Christians were no longer merely second-class subjects. They were portrayed as internal enemies. The ideological mix of nationalism, Islamization, and administrative precision produced a machinery of persecution more efficient than anything before it. From the screams in the cloister to the silent ruins of churches, the story has been told. What then is the legacy of this unhealed wound in our modern world? The lingering cry. A century has passed, yet the battle over memory continues. More than 30 nations, from France and Germany to the United States and Canada, have formally recognized the Armenian, Greek, and Assyrian genocides as deliberate campaigns of extermination. Each resolution represents not just a diplomatic statement, but a moral line drawn against erasure. Yet the Turkish state, heir to the Ottoman Empire, continues to deny that a genocide ever took place, framing the massacres as wartime chaos rather than premeditated policy. School books omit the truth that several archives remain sealed, and speaking too openly about 1915 can still invite prosecution under laws against insulting Turkishness. The demographic result is visible on every map. Before the First World War, Christians made up nearly a quarter of Anatolia's population. Today they account for less than 1%. The lands that once echoed with the bells of churches from Trabzon to Van now hold their silence. The communities that preserved Greek, Armenian, and Assyrian languages, art, and faith for over 2.5 millennia have been dispersed across the globe. The persecution of nuns, priests, and civilians was not an isolated tragedy. It was the dissolution of an entire civilization within living memory. Every generation that refuses to speak of it deepens the wound. And yet, memory persists in the hymns sung in diaspora churches, in the faded family photographs rescued from burning homes, in the ruins of monasteries that still rise roofless and unbowed against the Anatolian sky. Thanks for watching. Now check out the videos popping up on screen for more unbelievable stories.